First of all, let me welcome everyone here. We have to take the alternate venue this morning because of our dinner dance, so I hope what we lack for altitude we make up in comfort and closeness. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here. So many familiar faces from previous years of this very important event, the Marlene Pompoer lecture. We want to thank Jerry Pompoer and family for sponsoring and hosting this event every year. And I want to just take a minute to note that this is the first time we are back in person in 3 years. So, mazel tov to us. This event remembers Marlene Pompoer, who loved the community and loved Jewish life and loved Jewish literature. And we wanted to find a way, when we started these lectures a few years ago, to blend that. And over the years, we've had some very impressive people to come and present to us and talk to us in all the areas that she loved. And I am sure that today will not disappoint at all. I want to turn it over to Jerry, who's going to introduce our lecture. I want to thank you all for being here on a Sunday morning in June when you could be doing a million other things, but you're here, and that is really wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your loving introduction, and mazel tov on the arrival of your granddaughter. There's nothing like a granddaughter. Thanks to Jerry Langa for structuring the Temple's Jerusalem Academy, which sponsors the Temple's speaker programs, including this. Today is another celebration of the immense subject of this lecture, Jews and literature. Today is also a tribute to Marlene on the virtual 10th anniversary of her death. So hard to accept that we have missed that actual decade of her laughter, her love, her happy enjoyment of literature. That devotion began in family history with her absorption of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, read in a single day on the grounds of the Edgar Allan Poe's cottage in her Bronx neighborhood. It culminated in special attention to the work of Jewish Americans such as Philip Roth and Cynthia Ozick. In her memory, specifically as Jewish Americans, we are gifted today by the expert guidance of Adam Kirsch. He sets the scene with one statistic. In 40 years, at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, 25 million Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe to the United States. As they jammed into ship bottoms, ran through Ellis Island processing, or, like my father, illegally crossed America's borders. They sewed dresses in sweatshops and attended night school to get English. They made a new home in exile, the title of Adam Kirsch's book, A New Home in Exile for its future intellectual leaders. Adam Kirsch is one of those leaders, beginning with his summa cum laude graduation from Harvard. Wow. I first encountered his work in a Rutgers adult course on Benjamin Disraeli, the leader of Britain's Conservative Party in the late 19th century and the first Jewish prime minister. And it's a fine book, and I recommend that to you too. He also has published 4 prize-winning books of his own poetry, 2 biographies of his own teachers, and writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New Yorker, Tablet, and other publications. He also somehow finds time to teach at Columbia and Princeton. After you hear him on Jewish American writers and Home in Exile, I urge you to go to the full work, The Blessing and the Curse, which deals with Jewish writers in the 20th century around the world. But for now, here's his take on America. Welcome to Home.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and I'm really honored to be here for the Pompoer lecture, and thank you to the Pompoer family for sponsoring and having me. And thank you, Rabbi. So it wasn't 25 million Jews, but only 2.5 million. You have to put in the decimal point. If it was 25 million Jews, then this would be a very different country. But 2.5 million was still a lot, and a lot more than 10 times as many as had been here before. Those earlier Jews were mainly from Germany, and starting in the 1880s, Jews started to arrive from the Tsarist Empire, Eastern Europe, mainly because things got very bad in Russia in 1881 after there was an assassination of the Tsar. And the Tsar, one of the assassins, he was a terrorist group that assassinated Tsar Alexander II, and who was known as a reformer and a liberal. But the radicals in this terrorist group assassinated him, and one or two of them were Jewish, and the government used it as an excuse for a persecution of Jews and enacted laws known as the May Laws, May 1882, that made life very hard for Jews in the Tsarist Empire, prevented them from owning land, forced them to move into certain villages and give up their homes. And so as things got worse and worse, people started to pour out. Most of them came to the United States, some went to other places, including England, South America, South Africa, and a few went to Palestine and created the nucleus of what would later become the State of Israel. But that was a drop in the bucket compared to the 2.5 million who came to the United States. And what they found here was a country that was very different from anything they were used to, right? It was a completely different kind of society, much more open, much more free. And although there was, of course, anti-Semitism, it wasn't official and legal government persecution as Jews had been used to in Europe in most places that they had lived. So in a way, coming to America challenged one of the basic preconceptions about Jewish identity, not just in Eastern Europe, but Jewish identity everywhere for the last 2,000 years, which is that we are people in exile, in galut, in diaspora. And the basic sort of story of Judaism is that after the temple was destroyed by the Romans and Jews scattered all over the Middle East and North Africa and Europe, that we were in exile waiting for the return to the Holy Land, which would come when the Messiah came. That idea was a sort of consolation in exile, and it meant that Jews were thinking about the future, thinking about redemption, and that's sort of one of the most important basic dynamics in Judaism. But when Jews came to America, they suddenly found themselves in a place where life was much better than the life they had left behind, and it got better over time, particularly after World War II. Because with the revelation of the Holocaust and the experience of Nazi anti-Semitism, and then the creation of the State of Israel, anti-Semitism became very unpopular, unfashionable in America for, let's say, half a century. And I think now it's coming back, unfortunately, not anywhere near the levels that it could be or had been, but it's no longer as taboo, I think, as it once was. But after World War II, there was this sort of unique moment where all kinds of Americans, and in particular in the context of this discussion, American readers, were very interested in Jews and Judaism. And they wanted to read Jewish novelists, they wanted to listen to Jewish comedians, they wanted to see Jewish movies, Jewish television shows. There was this fundamentally sort of positive attention given to Jews, which was something very unusual in Jewish history. So the question for Jewish American writers, and the reason why the title of this lecture is At Home in Exile, is America still exile? Is America still galut? Is it a place where we feel that we are sort of sojourning, we're staying temporarily until we are gathered into the land of Israel? Of course, the other reason why that's a more complicated question now than it was for most of Jewish history is that we could actually go to the land of Israel. For most of Jewish history, that was not an option. Very, very few people went. Often very pious people towards the end of their lives would go to Palestine to end their lives there. But the idea that you could just get on a plane and go to Jerusalem is a completely revolutionary idea. And when we say in the Seder every year, next year in Jerusalem, in the past that meant the Messiah will come and we'll all be gathered to Jerusalem. Now it means, you could go tomorrow, go to the airport, get a ticket, and go to Jerusalem. So the question is, if we don't do that, and we're still living here in America, why is that? What does being Jewish in America mean? What are the opportunities that it brings, the blessings, and also what are the challenges that it brings? Well, one of the challenges, I think, is that it makes us ask what it means to be Jewish. Because in the old world, in Eastern Europe, it was very clear what it meant to be Jewish. If you were born into a Jewish community, it meant you spoke a different language than everyone else. It meant that you lived apart from everyone else. You didn't live in the same places. You didn't intermarry. You didn't socialize. You spoke Yiddish rather than Russian or Polish. All of those things, you ate different food, you had a different culture. All of those things ensured a lot of separation between Jews and their neighbors. It was very clear, and you might remember that a couple of years ago, when Bernie Sanders was running for president and he referred to his ancestors as Polish, or said he was a Polish American or something like that, and a lot of Jews said, wait a minute, no one in Poland would have said that your ancestors were Polish. They would have said they were Jews who lived in Poland, and it was a very real distinction. That's not really true in America, I think. Here, Jews are equal citizens, can ascend to the highest levels of office, can succeed in many different areas of life. There's not the same restrictions, and there's also not the same obvious markers of identity. So we speak the same language as everyone else. We speak English, we live in the same places, we work in the same places. Increasingly, many Jews don't observe traditional laws of kashrut or aren't Sabbath observant. So our ways of life are not necessarily different from our neighbors. So with all of these things that marked out Judaism and defined it sort of diminishing in America, the question is, what does it mean to be Jewish? If it doesn't mean all of those things that it used to mean, what does it mean? So what I'm going to do today is talk about three great Jewish American fiction writers who address this question in various ways in their writing. And they're all names you'll recognize: Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, and Philip Roth. And I'm going to start by talking about Bellow's novel, The Adventures of Augie March, which was published in 1953. That was his sort of breakthrough novel. He had written two novels before that he later referred to as his MA and his PhD pieces, because he felt that they weren't really mature work. They weren't what he was fully capable of. And in fact, one of those novels, the second one, The Victim, is all about anti-Semitism. It's a novel in which a Jew who works in a trade publication, a trade magazine in New York, is blamed by a Gentile for having caused him to lose his job. And this Gentile becomes obsessed with him and essentially follows him around and stalks him and threatens him, and feels that the Jew has victimized him by taking his job. And of course, the Jew feels that the Gentile is victimizing him because he's threatening him and becoming a sort of a stalker. So that was something that Bellow wrote in, I think, 1948 is when it was published. It's very much a post-Holocaust book, although it's not about the Holocaust. It's all set in New York, but it's all about anti-Semitism and how people become obsessed with Jews and how it affects the way Jews think about themselves. So 5 years later, he wrote The Adventures of Augie March, or published The Adventures of Augie March, which is a very, very different kind of book in terms of style and also in the way it thinks about what it means to be Jewish. And the book is very long, won the National Book Award. I think it was the year after Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison won the National Book Award, and Bellow and Ellison were actually good friends and lived together for a time when they were both teaching at Bard College. They shared a house. So it won the National Book Award, and it was the beginning of a 20-year period where, in those 20 years, Jewish writers won the National Book Award 8 times, which, when you think about the percentage of Jews in the population, is a lot more than you would expect. And Bellow was responsible for 2 more of those wins. So to a writer like John Updike, who was a WASP and who belonged to the sort of culture that had traditionally dominated American literature, this was a very startling development. And he wrote a series of novels about a fictional Jewish novelist named Henry Beck. The first one, I think, is called Beck, a Book. And then he wrote several sequels to it. And he later explained, the book had not so much been about a Jew as about a writer who was a Jew with the same inevitability that a fictional rug salesman would be an Armenian. Updike explained. In other words, at that time, being a writer, being an American writer, was like a Jewish trade. And of course, that's not a very polite thing to say about Armenians or about Jews, and you can tell that Updike was not totally happy with this development because it marginalized him. But for a brief time, it could seem that to be an American novelist was to be a Jewish novelist. And in that period, Bellow, Malamud, and Roth were sort of the leading Jewish writers. Bellow once remarked that they were the Hart, Schaffner, and Marx of writing. And again, that's not a completely positive description either, because he felt that they were maybe being ghettoized a little bit or associated with each other and not with other kinds of writers. But it clearly wasn't only Jews who were reading these best-selling novels. Christian audiences were fascinated with Jewishness, and American Jewish writers could communicate with those audiences because they were just as fascinated with what it meant to be Jewish, because they were wondering themselves. They were estranged from it in a certain way. They had to answer the question, well, what does it mean for us to be Jewish? I'll say that none of these writers, and in fact few American Jewish writers, were religious at all. Most of them grew up not knowing much about Judaism and not being at all interested in it. They thought that the interesting part of American life was outside of the Jewish community, and they wanted to explore it and get to know it. So if Jewishness wasn't a religious belief or a language, what constituted Jewishness? So in The Adventures of Augie March, Bellow's hero describes himself as a sort of Columbus of those near at hand. And he wrote about American life, like in that spirit, as an explorer. And in case there's any doubt, the novel starts with the famous sentence, "I am an American, Chicago born." So right at the beginning, he's saying, "I'm an American," and in fact, the last word of the novel is America, which, coincidentally or not, just as the Torah ends with the word Yisrael, this book ends with the word America. Bellow may not have had this precedent in mind, but it's symbolically fitting because in his work we see America taking the place of the land of Israel as the spiritual home of American Jews. And readers at the time were very conscious that that's what Bellow was doing. The critic Norman Podhoretz, who went on to become a sort of famous conservative intellectual, but at the time was mainly a literary critic, said, "Bellow spoke for and embodied the impulse which had been growing among all the members of the second American Jewish generation, to lay a serious claim to their identity as Americans and their right to play a more than marginal role in the literary culture of this country." Bellow made that claim with his style as much as his subject matter. In his earlier work, his writing had been very sort of clean, severe, straightforward. In Augie March, it was very energetic. There's sort of a lot of slang mixed with a lot of very highbrow references and language. And he brings these things together in an unapologetic way. And you can hear it in that first sentence. "I am an American, Chicago-born, Chicago, that somber city, and will go at things as I've taught myself, freestyle, and will make the record in my own way. First to knock, first admitted, sometimes an innocent knock, sometimes a not so innocent." That sentence, with its evocation of Huckleberry Finn and Walt Whitman, declares Bellow's intention to put himself right in the middle, the main line of American literature. That's his birthright, and nothing will stop him from claiming it. Over and over again in Augie March, Bellow insists that being born into a poor immigrant family does not disqualify him from participating in the most important human experiences. But the birthright that Bellow was talking about was not as straightforward in real life as he makes it seem in the novel. For one thing, he himself could not have said what Augie March does. He was not born an American, and he was not, although he later lived much of his life in Chicago and is known as a Chicago writer, he was not born there. He was born in Lachine, which is a suburb of Montreal, where his parents had come from Russia. And then they crossed over the border illegally into the United States, so he was an illegal immigrant. As many American Jews were, if not entering this country illegally, many left the countries they were leaving illegally. So his parents came south, and he grew up in Chicago in the Humboldt Park neighborhood, which was a poor Jewish neighborhood at the time. For Augie March, being an American means becoming acquainted with the dark corners of America. He's in the novel, he's hanging out with thieves and smugglers, abortionists, con men, and he receives a lot of his education from these kinds of people. But at the same time that he's experiencing these realities, he's also embracing the highest traditions of Western civilization, which he discovers by reading. And characteristically, the way he's introduced to the great books is not in a lecture hall, but he's recruited by a friend to be part of an operation that steals textbooks from bookstores and sells them to students. And so he starts stealing books and then reading them, and then he becomes sort of self-educated. And as a result, the novel is full of literary and historical references, and that's supposed to be how Augie March learned them. Saul Bellow himself did go to University of Chicago and Northwestern and was in fact a professor, so he didn't have to steal the books that Augie March does. So he knows that a Jewish boy growing up in a slum might not seem like the natural audience for the Western canon. And it's interesting today when there's a lot of discussion about who decides what the canon is, who decides what books we are supposed to know and supposed to read. Today we often talk about that in terms of race or gender or sexuality. In Bellow's time, thinking about it in terms of religion would have been very natural. The idea that these books were not written for Jews, the great books of Western civilization were written by Jews or for Jews. Certainly Jews weren't teaching them in universities at the time in the 1920s and 30s before Jews really were allowed into to become professors. So it wasn't obvious that someone like Augie March or someone like Saul Bellow would claim these books as his inheritance. But for Bellow, it doesn't matter what your background is. The most American quality that Augie March has is his certainty that everything that has to do with the mind is democratic. Like he says in that first sentence, first to knock, first admitted. They're open to anyone. And Bellow was one of a generation of American Jews that was not afraid to knock. And so he says in the book, and what did I think of myself in relation to the great occasions, the more sizable being of these books? Why, I saw them, first of all. And for him, culture is the possession of everyone who can see it and understand it, regardless of what we would now call their identity. Bellow doesn't worry that Augie's own adventures could also be described as shabby and unimportant because he doesn't do anything, famous or world historical. He's bumping around the margins of Chicago life. But for Bellow, what matters is the quality of the inner experience, not what's on the outside. He's searching for human greatness. And the surprising thing is that he so often finds it even in the humble setting of Chicago's Jewish slums. So a good example of that in the novel is the character called William Einhorn, a neighborhood figure who's one of many substitute parents that Augie encounters. Einhorn's arms and legs are paralyzed so that he needs help to perform the most basic bodily functions. And what he actually does for a living, his business, is sort of silly and definitely petty. He does things like he sends away for free samples to resell, enters newspaper and radio contests, and writes a newsletter called The Shut-In for people like him who can't go outside. But Augie says that Einhorn was the first superior man I knew, living proof of the possibility that you could be great even in reduced circumstances. With his plots and schemes, his ability to manipulate people and institutions, Einhorn demonstrates the same qualities that in a king or general would make them famous. I'd ask myself, what would Caesar suffer in this case? What would Machiavelli advise or Ulysses do? What would Einhorn think? I'm not kidding when I enter Einhorn in this eminent list, Augie says. The insistence that life here and now is as full of possibility as any other time and place is Bellow's American creed, reflecting the contrast between the wide world open to him and the much narrower environment his ancestors had left behind. Augie March grows up hearing stories about the old world from Mr. Antical, who's the freethinker, the village atheist in this neighborhood, whose faith was destroyed when he witnessed a pogrom back in Europe. And he talks about seeing his brother killed in front of him. And he says, so don't talk to me about God. But it was he that talked about God all the time, Bellow says. Augie, on the other hand, almost never talks about God, certainly not the God of the Torah. Judaism for him is local color. It's not really an intellectual tradition. It's not something you have to say or you believe in it or you don't believe it. It's just sort of the way things are where he lives. The people in his world who take religion seriously are older people who he talks about the old faces and voices, gruff, whispered, wheezy, heart grumbled, noisily swarm-toned, singing off the Hebrew of the evening prayers. By contrast, the younger generation had to be prompted when it came their turn to recite the Orphan's Kaddish. The ancient prayers are becoming unfamiliar to the American-born Jews. But as for those who deny his right as a Jew to claim an American identity, Augie dismisses them with indifference. He says, sometimes we were chased, stoned, bitten, and beat up for Christ killers, but I never had any special grief from it or brooded, being by and large too larky and boisterous to take it to heart. And that's sort of that's Bellow in a nutshell. He's not going to allow bigots, anti-Semites, or anyone to stop him from taking all of life that he wants, from being larky and boisterous. And the energy of the novel has a lot to do with Bellow's decision to not allow being Jewish to be a problem for him. And you could even say that he's one of the first writers in a Western language for whom being Jewish is not a problem, but in fact a source of joy rather than anxiety, which is especially interesting because, as I mentioned before, his previous novel had been all about anti-Semitism and all about being a victim. And in this novel, it's as though he's saying, no more of that. We're going to talk about all of the positive, the excitement and the opportunity. So Bernard Malamud was much more mysterious and complicated when it came to writing about Jewishness. His short stories mainly appeared in Jewish-flavored magazines like Partisan Review and Commentary, but they could also be found in The Atlantic and Playboy, a sign that his themes had crossover appeal. And that was fitting because running through Malamud's stories is the idea that, as he once said in an interview, all men are Jews except they don't know it. So when you think about what does that statement mean, well, it means that Jewishness means something different to Malamud than it meant in the past historically. It doesn't mean that you believe in a specific religion. It doesn't mean that you follow certain laws. It doesn't mean that your ancestors were part of a chosen people. He's saying that being Jewish is a sort of condition. It's a metaphysical condition that anyone can experience. It's open to everyone. And that has the effect, in a sort of paradoxical way, of making Jews both very different, because it means that Jews are sort of the paradigm of what it means to be spiritual, but also very normal, because it means that there's nothing about being Jewish that a non-Jew can't also experience in themselves and can't find in themselves. So it's actually a very good formula for American Jewishness, because it means that being Jewish is no longer a fact, it's about a feeling. It's about something inside, it's a feeling. What does being Jewish mean in Malamud's stories? On one level, it means that most of his characters have an Ashkenazi last name. They're called things like Levin and Finkel, Davidov. And his style is very shaped by the rhythm of Yiddish. So these people talk in English that clearly is sort of imitating Yiddish sentence structure and patterns. So one character in one story says, "What's the matter? You don't pull the shade up." There's many examples like that. More important, in these stories, in Malamud's stories, being Jewish almost always means being poor, often a poor storekeeper, like Malamud's own father. For Bellow, in Augie March, poverty was a condition that didn't make life dull and gray. It didn't preclude vivid and important experiences. But Malamud's poor Jews do live in a gray world, a joyless world, where all they can do is hope to keep going from day to day. Often they don't even achieve that much. Their stores go bankrupt, they get evicted, they get arthritis and can't keep working. A character in the story called The Cost of Living, who's owns a small grocery, a big chain store opens up down the street and it drives him out of business. He has to go out of business, and he says, after all the years, the thousands of cans he had wiped off and packed away, the milk cases dragged in like rocks from the street before dawn, the hours, the work, the years, my God, where's my life now? This character says. But it isn't just misfortune that makes someone Jewish. For Malamud, it's the attitude they adopt in the face of suffering. This is a resigned expectation of being a victim, and at the same time, being faithful to this ethical code that the rest of the world has forgotten. So Jews are victims, but they're, in a sense, expect to be victims, and they don't allow it to change them, to change the way they believe and behave. In a story called The Death of Me, the Jewish character is a tailor named Marcus, and he employs two workers, a Pole and an Italian, who are always fighting each other, getting into fights. And Marcus is always trying to keep the peace between them. But in the end, they can't stop fighting. They threaten each other with weapons, but neither of them ends up killing each other. Instead, it's Marcus who falls down dead because his heart is unable to bear the strain of living surrounded by violence. He's too good for the world. And in the last lines of the story, Malamud suggests that his fate was inevitable. Although the old Jew's eyes were glazed as he crumpled, the assassins could plainly read in them, "What did I tell you? You see?" For Malamud, it's the Jew who bears the burden of the world's guilt. Another hallmark of his stories, another thing that they're famous for, is that supernatural elements sort of quietly intrude into ordinary life. this other world, the supernatural world that his Jewish characters make contact with, has nothing in common with Jewish traditional ideas about mysticism or supernatural. I don't think Malamud knew much about those traditions. But in his stories, it's always the Jewish characters who have these supernatural experiences, and you get the impression that this is another part of what it means to be Jewish for him, is that you're open to things beyond the normal. One of the most famous examples is his story, The Magic Barrel. That might be his best known story, where he opposes conventional Jewish observance to the more deeper and genuine mysticism that for him is the essence of being truly Jewish. So The Magic Barrel is a story, it's actually rare in Malamud's work for being about a religious Jew, or actually a rabbinical student at Yeshiva University in Uptown Manhattan. Finkel, the main character, is a modern Orthodox, so he's American enough to feel a little embarrassed to consult a matchmaker when he wants to get married. He finds a matchmaker named Salzman. But his reasons for wanting to get married are unromantic and practical. He thinks it'll be easier to get a pulpit if he's married, basically. So he decides to see what this marriage broker, Salzman, has to offer. Salzman is a mischievous and an uncanny figure. Malamud always has him being hard to find, but then suddenly he'll appear when you're not expecting him. But the women he's trying to interest Finkel in marrying are not his taste. He always says they're too old or they're too plain, and you get the sense that he's very conceited. He thinks he deserves the best of the best, and no one is good enough for him. He only begins to soften when he goes on a stroll with a woman who's Salzman's client he's introduced to, and then he goes out on a date with her and realizes that she's much older than he was told, much older than he'd been led to believe. And he realizes that just as the matchmaker has been lying to him about the woman, she's been lying to the woman about him too, and saying that he is some kind of religious genius or a passionate prophet, when he has to admit that, in fact, I am not a talented religious person, he says. I think that I came to God not because I loved him, but because I did not. So for the first time, he's starting to doubt himself a little bit. The arrogance and the egotism are starting to crumble. So what's interesting about this character is that as a rabbi, he's sort of the most Jewish person you can imagine, but for Malamud, he's not Jewish enough, not in the way that matters, which is that he doesn't have this sense of humility and victimhood that he thinks of as the essence of Jewishness. And he has to sort of develop that, and that's what the story is about. And he does that by falling in love, this time not in a sort of worldly way, but helplessly and obsessively falling in love with a woman whose photograph Salzman accidentally leaves behind in his apartment. And when he asks about this woman, he says, well, I'd like to be fixed up with her. Salzman gets very angry and upset and says, no, she's not available. You shouldn't have seen that. That wasn't supposed to be here. It turns out that it's his own daughter, named Stella, and that he has disowned her for some reason that he doesn't name, but it's implied has something to do with promiscuity. He says she's a wild one, wild without shame, like an animal, like a dog. But learning this terrible truth only confirms Finkel's desire for Stella. What he needs to truly fall in love and to become a real man of God is to experience the pity that was missing from his Jewishness. Love of an unworthy woman is what will accomplish this for him. And he says, Malamud writes, he then concluded to convert her to goodness and himself to God. His transformation even takes physical form. Leo had grown a pointed beard and his eyes were weighted with wisdom. So before he was clean shaven, like a modern American, and now he's got a Jewish beard. And Malamud suggests that in order to be Jewish, you have to know suffering. And the story ends with the lovers finally meeting as Salzman chants what Malamud says is prayers for the dead. But Malamud doesn't, the story ends without telling us which is going to prevail, whether Finkel's faith and love will win the day and everything will turn out okay, or this curse is going to lead them both to disaster. At one point in the story, he actually thinks, did Salzman accidentally on purpose leave this photo behind, knowing that he would become obsessed with it? So if Jewishness is not a historical fact or biographical fact, but a spiritual potential that anyone can have, there's no reason why only Ashkenazi immigrants from Eastern Europe should be able to have it. And in some of his stories, Malamud suggests that other kinds of people and even animals can be Jewish. One of the stories is called The Jew Bird. It's a very funny but very satirical story, but I won't talk about that one in detail. Instead, I'm going to talk about the story Angel Levine, which was turned into a movie at one point. And it's about a typical Malamud character named Manischewitz, a tailor who he's like Job, one bad thing after another is happening to him. His business burns to the ground, his son is killed, his wife is dying, and he is visited by an angel who offers to help. But while this angel bears the Jewish name of Alexander Levine, he takes the form of an African-American man, an appearance that leaves Manischewitz confused and suspicious. He sends Levine away, but soon he becomes desperate enough to change his mind and go looking for him. And he goes to Harlem to try to find him, and his faith is further challenged when he sees the angel drinking and dancing in a nightclub. But in this dream version of Harlem, he also finds a group of 4 black men studying Torah in a storefront synagogue and debating the nature of the soul, and he hears them talking about it. But has the spirit got some kind of a shade or color, one asks, and another replies, man, of course not, a spirit is a spirit. And a spirit, for Malamud, is always somehow a Jewish spirit. Jewishness is the language of the divine, even when it's spoken by Gentiles. It's not until Manischewitz realizes this and declares that he believes that Levine is an angel, he really believes it, that his wife gets better and the miracle is able to take place, the angel is able to cure her. And the story concludes with a perfect statement of Malamud's idea about Jewishness. A wonderful thing, Fanny, Manischewitz said. Believe me, there are Jews everywhere. With this sort of very naive, but also very shocking statement, Malamud finds a way of reconciling what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be American. He's saying that a Jew is something that anyone can be or can become. Anyone who knows suffering and humiliation understands what it means to be Jewish. And for Malamud, that's why the poor and oppressed are sort of like honorary Jews, even as some actual Jews in his stories don't qualify as Jews. And the Jew bird, I'll just talk about a little bit, is a story about a Jewish family where a Jewish bird flies in the window and asks them to like give it shelter. And it's a bird that speaks English and some Yiddish, and it asks for herring to eat because it's its favorite food. And what happens over the course of the story is that the family that's taken it in gets sick and tired of this freeloading bird and eventually like persecutes it and kills it. And so it's a story about how the Jews become anti-Semites to the Jewish bird. And it's sort of Malamud's way of saying, just as anyone can be Jewish, anyone can be an anti-Semite in this way of thinking. It has to do with what's inside and not what's outside. So Bellow and Malamud were both born in the 19-teens, and they were both first-generation Americans, the first members of their family born in the United States. When you turn to Philip Roth, the great New Jersey writer, he is of a younger generation. He was born in 1933, so he was born 20 years after the others. And that meant that he came of age in a very different Jewish world. Malamud and Bellow were born to Yiddish-speaking immigrant parents and became adults during the Depression. Roth was a second-generation American. He grew up speaking English, and he came of age in World War II and after in a prosperous world where Jews were beginning to move into the suburbs. And this movement exposed Jews to different kinds of pressures. In the 1950s, Jews in America became more religiously observant, and that was part of a social trend that saw all kinds of people become more religiously observant. Protestants and Catholics, everyone was going to synagogue and church more in the 50s, and the historian Jonathan Sarna, who's a historian of American Judaism, says in his History of American Judaism that in the 1950s, 60% of American Jews belonged to a synagogue, which is the highest that it's ever been before or since. The only time in the 20th century that more than half of American Jews belonged to a synagogue. This was a new way of thinking about Jewish community, which emphasized membership in one of the 3 denominations, right? Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox. At the same time, Jews developed a new sense that American society was more open to them than ever before. The decades after the Holocaust saw a decline in anti-Semitism. Institutions that had barred Jews or set quotas on them began to open their doors. And most important of all, in the long term, younger American Jews were discarding the taboo against marrying non-Jews. So in the first half of the 20th century, intermarriage, the rate of intermarriage was about 7%. By the 1980s, it was 50%. For Roth, these changes translated into a new way of seeing and thinking about Jewish life. His fiction not only portrays the new assimilated Jewish middle class, usually in a satirical way, it also asks questions that these new kinds of Jews were asking about themselves. Was being Jewish still in tension with being American? Should Jews maintain the same kind of loyalty to the tribe that their ancestors did, and sort of see themselves as one group and everyone else as outsiders? Maybe Jewishness, which had lost its role as a religious identity for American Jews, for American Jewish writers almost from the beginning, was now destined to lose its social meaning as well. And that possibility opens up new horizons of guilt and anxiety and self-doubt, which Roth writes about. After all, to step outside the tight circle of Jewish life was to make a bet on assimilation. And this was happening just as assimilation in Europe had failed disastrously and ended in the Holocaust. It was clear that when Jews in Europe thought that they could assimilate and become just regular Germans, just regular Frenchmen, that was a mistake, and it was not a possibility, and in fact it was a disaster. So Roth is always haunted by the knowledge that in the same years when he was growing up in Newark, in the neighborhood that he always writes about, Jewish children his age in Europe were being killed in gas chambers. And much of his career was spent asking the question, which is the real Jewish fate? As American Jews, which is the one that we should expect? Is America's welcome reliable, or should Jews continue to practice the strategies of caution that history has taught us? What would it mean for Jews to feel like they were truly at home in America? And he's asked these questions throughout his career, starting with his first book, Goodbye Columbus, which was published in 1959. And the way he did it, and the reason why he was so controversial, is that he would find the most uncomfortable places in the American Jewish psyche and sort of jab them and see what happens. To face down the criticism that he received from many Jewish authority figures, Roth maintained that the highest duty for a writer was to tell the truth. And America, he believed, was a place where Jewish writers could tell the truth without fear. He gave away all of his own secrets about Jewishness and sexuality and literary ambition in a very sort of reckless and defiant way, which in a way was a gauge of how much he trusted America. He said, I can say all these things and admit all these things and nothing bad will happen to me because in America it's safe. And he made that argument in a 1963 essay called Writing About Jews, which is one of the sort of most famous things ever written on this subject by an American writer. In this essay, he talks about how much criticism he got for Goodbye Columbus, which was a bestseller and won a National Jewish Book Award, but also was very heavily criticized by Jewish community leaders because of the way it portrayed Jews. And Roth says the only thing that he did in the book was write about Jews as honestly as any writer is expected to write about human beings. Yet some Jews believed that in doing so, he says, quote, I had informed on the Jews, I had told the Gentiles what apparently would otherwise have been possible to keep secret from them, that the perils of human nature afflict the members of our minority. To such critics, Roth writes, being conscious and being candid is too risky. But he rejects that, saying that that's a misunderstanding of American conditions. Jews who believe that unflattering fiction about Jews will fuel anti-Semitism are wrong about the country they live in. He writes, if the barrier between prejudice and persecution collapsed in Germany, this is hardly reason to contend that no such barrier exists in our country. The lives of Jews no longer take place in a world that is just landsmen and enemies. The cry, watch out for the Goyim, at times seems more the expression of an unconscious wish than of a warning. I wish that they were all out there so that we could be together in here, he writes. The real challenge, Roth suggests, is for Jews to figure out what unites them now that anti-Semitism no longer does. Like Bellow, Roth sees America as being about freedom and individualism versus Judaism, which is about loyalty and obligation. But if Roth didn't understand what it meant to feel that claim of Jewish obligation, he wouldn't have written about it so much and made so many sort of jabs at it. Roth felt that the right to be himself is something that had to be constantly defended, using the weapons of comedy and aggression. And the stories in Goodbye Columbus test the limits of Jewish solidarity, asking whether an individual Jew is obligated to see himself, first of all, as a member of the Jewish people. In the story, the Defender of the Faith, he provocatively asks, should Jews be more loyal to one another than they are to American institutions, in this case, the army? The story is set during the last months of World War II and centers on Sergeant Nathan Marks. He's a combat veteran who's now training recruits at an American army base. Marks is a Jew who's disarmed anti-Semitism and proved himself to be a real American by being a hero. although his commanding officer is constantly saying, I see you as a soldier and not a Jew, is implicitly refuting itself, because he wouldn't say that unless he actually did think of him as a Jew. So the challenge for Marx in the story is to preserve this hard-won Americanness when he meets a new recruit called Sheldon Grossbart, who first forces Marx to acknowledge their shared Jewishness and then starts to presume upon it to ask for special treatment. Grossbart asks Marx to make sure that he and 2 other soldiers are excused from cleaning the barracks on Friday night so that they can go to prayer services. And Marx agrees reluctantly, only to find that they spend the whole service horsing around. They're not actually taking it seriously. Similar requests for kosher food and a pass to attend a Seder on Passover also turn out to be insincere. And Grossbart is manipulating Marx's Jewish sentiments for personal advantage. Finally, Grossbart tries to meddle with the assignments that the soldiers are given in order to get himself out of having to go fight in Japan, because this is towards the end of the war. And in disgust, Marx intervenes and changes it to make sure that Grossbart is sent into combat. The story is very uncomfortable to read, even now. Thank you. And the discomfort comes from the way that Grossbart seems to live up to so many anti-Semitic stereotypes. He's clannish, he's pushy, he's a coward, he thinks he deserves special treatment, he assumes that Jews will always help each other at the expense of Gentiles. And Marx has to prove that Jews can actually be as patriotic and self-sacrificing as any American. In the end, it's Marx, not Grossbart, who deserves the title Defender of the Faith. He is the defender of the faith, but the faith that he defends is the faith in American values, which Grossbart is trying to subvert. "You call this watching out for me, what you did?" Grossbart demands at the end of the story, to which Marx responds, "No, for all of us." And that us includes Jews, but also goes beyond them. He's saying, in refusing to help you, I'm actually doing what's best for the Jews and for America as a whole. The claims of Jewishness can't be allowed to interfere with deeper claims of fairness and duty. Of course, by suggesting that sometimes they do interfere, Roth was saying something that many Jewish critics weren't happy about and wanted to deny. Notably, Grossbart is not a religious person. He's not really interested in Judaism. He's not interested in Judaism as a religion. He only is using Jewishness as an excuse to gain special privileges. And what Roth is sort of suggesting here is that Jewishness is an identity made up of family sentiment, insincere rituals, bits of Yiddish, and suspicion of outsiders. This kind of Jewishness for Roth is grounded in fear and hypocrisy, and he thinks it deserves all the mockery it gets. And a similar, the same target is approached sort of from a different point of view in the story Eli the Fanatic in the same book. He suggests in Defender of the Faith, he says this kind of new American Jewishness is not compatible with being a good American, and in Eli the Fanatic he suggests it's not compatible even with being a good Jew. It's about a man named Eli Peck, who is an assimilated Jewish middle-class person living in Woodinton, New Jersey, and he belongs to a group whose only concern in life is fitting in and not rocking the boat. He writes in a letter, "Woodinton is a progressive suburban community whose members, both Jewish and Gentile, are anxious that their families live in comfort and beauty and serenity." But the person he's writing that letter to is a man named Leo Tsuref, who he's basically telling to stay out of Woodinton because he's too Jewish. He's a Hasid and a Holocaust survivor who's recently arrived from post-war Europe and started running a yeshiva for refugee children out of a large house in the town. When another Hasid from the school comes into the town to do errands, he's dressed, in Hasidic clothes, 18th century clothes, and has a long beard, and it makes all the assimilated Jews very anxious to see this in their town. It represents a throwback to the neighborhoods that they have escaped. And one of Eli's friends says, "If I wanted to live in Brownsville, I'd live in Brownsville." They're trying to get away from this, but above all, Leo Tsuref and his followers are troubling because they are Jews who are not interested in becoming American. And this is something that Roth was writing about in the 50s, and it is absolutely still a crucial part of Jewish life today, the way Jews interact with each other and think about each other. They're not interested in becoming American. For them, America really is just another Galut country. It's another place where they happen to be living when they're in exile, but it's not home, the way it is for Eli and his sort of other variety of Jews. So Eli is asked by his Jewish neighbors to convince Suref to shut down his school and leave, or at least if he's going to walk around the town, wear modern clothes. And Suref refuses all these demands, and he reproaches Eli for disturbing people who have just escaped from the Holocaust. He says about a man who's just come to town, he has nothing. You have that word in English? A mother and father? No. A wife? No. A baby? A little 10-month-old baby? No. The Jewish people, Leo says, is one people regardless of where they live, and they're responsible for one another. So it's sort of a serious and earnest way of making the same argument that Grossbart was making, that Jews have to be loyal to each other above all. And Eli is the one who was chosen by his neighbors to sort of get them out, but he ends up sympathizing with this idea. And he ends up donating one of his own suits to the yeshiva so that when the man comes to town, he can wear something that will not make him stand out. And then, surprisingly, he opens the drawer the next day and finds that the man has sent his clothes to Eli in a box. In a Malamutian touch, he puts them on and is transformed into the thing that he feared, a real, unmistakable Jew. He has a nervous breakdown, and he goes to the hospital wearing the Hasidic outfit, and everyone assumes that he's insane. And the story ends with him being dragged off and sedated. The last line of the story is, the drug calmed his soul, but did not touch it down where the blackness had reached. And the blackness, I think, in that is the color of the clothes, the Hasidic clothes. And Ross suggests that by wearing them, Eli has been really changed on the inside, or really maybe reminded of what his insides really are, what color they really are. And that perhaps being truly Jewish means embracing a kind of holy madness that Woodington has forgotten about. So the last story that I'm going to talk about of Roth and the Lest in the talk, another story from Goodbye Columbus, is called The Conversion of the Jews. And it's about a young boy named Ozzie Friedman, who is a rebellious Hebrew school student. And he's sort of like Roth in miniature. He's someone who can't stop pointing out all the inconsistencies in the way that Jews live. He drives the rabbi crazy with his questions precisely because they are good questions. So he asks, like, if God can do anything, why couldn't he impregnate the Virgin Mary? And he gets in trouble for asking questions like this. More challengingly, he had wanted to know how Rabbi Binder could call the Jews the chosen people if the Declaration of Independence claimed that all men are created equal. Here, Ozzie spotlights the same tension between Jewishness and Americanness that we saw in these other stories. If Jews are supposed to be good Americans, how can they also see themselves as a people set apart? This kind of tribalism seems suspect. For instance, when Ozzie's mother reads about a plane crash in the newspaper and calls it a tragedy only because she counted 8 Jewish names on the casualty list. Ozzie's rebellion comes to a head one afternoon in Hebrew school when he shouts at the rabbi, "You don't know anything about God," and runs up to the roof of the synagogue. At first, he has no intention of jumping off, but when he sees how upset the rabbi is, he starts to play with the idea. After all, annoying the rabbi is his favorite form of self-expression. Soon his mother arrives, the fire department brings a net, and Ozzie finds he's enjoying more attention than he's ever gotten in his life. Finally, he takes advantage of it by making the whole crowd, including the rabbi, say they believed in Jesus Christ. First one at a time, then all together. Only then does he jump into the safety net. So clearly that story is kind of about Roth and about Roth's position as a writer. Like Ozzie, he's impatient with all of the evasiveness and the pieties of tribalism that he thinks of as Jewish, and he can't stop comparing the actual behavior of Jews with their beliefs and saying that they're not living up to them. But at the same time, Roth recognizes that there's something juvenile about that kind of provocation and constantly trying to test and bother people. When Ozzie is on the roof, he yells, "Is it me, capital me. He yells as he careens around the roof, expressing what Roth considers the highest literary and ethical value, which is the self-expression, being free to be yourself. But in this case, it's a child running around yelling me, and you realize that it's not actually the most sophisticated ideal. The use that Ozzie makes of his power is proof that he is, in fact, immature. And what he manages to prove is that the Jewish community is more loyal to him than he is to it. They will do whatever is required to save his life, even say that they believe in Jesus. What Roth intuits is that the highest American Jewish value is not belief in God. Jewish communities in other times and places, it would have been better to become a martyr, or as Ozzie's classmates interpret the word, a Martin. than to publicly say that you believe in Jesus. But in America, it's the community itself, its preservation, that is the most deeply felt obligation. So I will finish there and just say that it's towards the end of his life, Philip Roth got a honorary doctorate from Jewish Theological Seminary, which was very funny because he had been known throughout his career as someone who was constantly giving Jews grief, and particularly rabbis. And then at the end of his life, he was sort of brought back into the fold and reclaimed. So it's a question whether that shows that he was right all along and people were sort of acknowledging him, or whether he sort of always was like Ozzy in that story. You know, he was running around and screaming and bothering people, but in the end, the community is more loyal to him than he was to it. They claimed him at the end. So thank you all very much for coming and listening. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer
I have
them
two
if I can.
questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, how did Roth react when he was given the PhD?
He took it. He went. He was played
Well,
along.
took it is one thing.
Yes, no, he
didn't
didn't
like it.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
he honored?
He was, yeah. He went to the ceremony. He made a nice speech, and he was not. He didn't cut up or anything like that. By that point in his life, I think he'd calmed down.
So
Yes.
the other question is, I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and I went through all of the things that you described.
Yeah.
And I'm still struggling with them.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a personal question. I don't know whether you're going to answer it or not. But what is your feeling? Where are we going?
That's a good question. If I knew, I would tell everyone. You mean as American Jews? As American Jews?
Yeah.
I think that things are changing, definitely. I think that